দর্শক, আর কয়েক ঘন্টা পরেই অনুষ্ঠিত হতে যাচ্ছে যুক্তরাষ্ট্রের ইতিহাসে এক নজিরবিহীন প্রেসিডেন্ট নির্বাচন। করোনা মহামারীর মধ্যে অনুষ্ঠিত হতে যাওয়া এই নির্বাচন নিয়ে মার্কিনীদের আগ্রহের যেমন শেষ নেই, তেমনি সারা বিশ্বের দৃষ্টি এই নির্বাচনের দিকেই। মার্কিন প্রেসিডেন্ট নির্বাচনের বিভিন্ন দিক নিয়ে কথা বলবো RTV নিয়মিত অনুষ্ঠান ফোর্থরাইটে। আপনাদের সঙ্গে আছে আমি সৈয়দ আশিক রহমান। আর আলোচনার জন্য আমাদের সঙ্গে যুক্ত হয়েছেন বাংলাদেশে মার্কিন দূতাবাসের পলিটিক্যাল এবং ইকোনমিক বিভাগের ডেপুটি কাউন্সিলর মিস ডন শেপেল এবং আন্তর্জাতিক সম্পর্ক বিশ্লেষক অধ্যাপক ডক্টর ইমতিয়াজ আহমেদ। Very welcome, Professor Imtiaz and Don Shepel at Forthright.
Thank you.
Professor Imtiaz, I would like to start with you. Why this year US presidential election is so important?
Thank you very much. I guess two reasons would be very important. One, no doubt, the issue of pandemic and the way I think pandemic got United States this time, particularly if you look at the rate of infection and also the casualty, both are very high. I guess that would be one issue because that pandemic is a global issue. So whatever happens in the election and the results, I'm sure after the election, it will have tremendous consequences in terms of vaccines, in terms of how public health ought to be, what will be the future of WHO, several other things. So pandemic is one of the critical one. And the second one is it relates to more with Donald Trump and the politics that he carried through in the last 4 years, which I refer to as a politics of singularity. He has gone into a singularity, and that is something which resulted in a little bit of deglobalization, kind of retreat from globalization, retreat in terms of relationship with China and several other countries throughout the world. So the question would be whether the politics of singularity would remain or not, or whether if there is a change in the US administration, whether the politics of singularity would be reversed and United States would go back to where it was, more inclusive, working more with partners, because what I think the politics singularity has done, not only vis-a-vis China, but even with Europe, the relationship has not been good. And recently, even with India, some of the remarks came from Donald Trump did not go well with India as well. So these are, I think, two critical issues which probably would be important, and we'll have to see what happens in the election.
Well, Professor Imtiaz, thank you very much. Ms. Shepel, how American citizens who are living in abroad cast their vote? Can you tell us about swing states and absentee voting during COVID?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm delighted to report that American citizens living in Bangladesh or anywhere else in the around the world are able to vote. The good news is all of our embassies facilitate this voting process. People apply to register to a vote from wherever they are in the world, and then they receive an absentee ballot, and they're able to mail it back through the embassy system. So that means that anywhere in the world, an American citizen is able to register their vote, which is really important, particularly in this election, where really every vote is going to matter even more than maybe even before. Also, when it comes to those votes mattering, that's where you see the swing states. The swing states are the many, many states, probably 10 or so, in the United States that will be very close. Each and every vote will matter, those that are happening now in pre-election voting or on election day, as well as the absentee ballots that will come in from overseas. Those states, really probably even only 4 or 5, may actually determine the final outcome of the election. So they're very, very important.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Shepel, why is the US electoral system is so important? How old this system is?
So the US Electoral College is actually a complicated mechanism, so I will try to explain it as best I can. It was actually originally created in the Constitution, in Article 1 of the Constitution, and the goal was for the United States founders to be able to balance the relationship between not wanting a direct vote by the population and wanting to be able to have full representation and independence at the executive branch level. They didn't want the executive, the president, to be beholden to Congress, but they also wanted an educated populace to be able to select that president. So what happens and how that has evolved over time is we now have elections in each and every state. The states control that election process. Individual voters elect representatives that will then cast those votes to the Electoral College. All told, there are 538 votes in that Electoral College. And to win the presidency, you need to get a plurality or 270 of those. So it's an incredibly important process that balances all of these different factors originally created by the founders.
Well, thank you. Professor Imtiaz, the strategists said a Biden victory would be most positive for China, Japan, and South Korea, while a Trump win would be beneficial for India, Vietnam, the Philippines, and also Taiwan. Do you differ with it?
Well, yes, I will differ with that because it's too early to tell, that the remark I think of Chuen Lai when he was asked about the impact of French Revolution, and he said it's too early to tell. So if the impact of French Revolution is too early to tell, I think the impact of whether a Biden victory or Donald Trump's return and what would happen in U.S. relationship with China, Japan, and other countries, I think it's too early to tell. But let's see, let's talk Donald Trump returns to power. He has been very unpredictable, and that's the point. And he can reverse things so quickly. I guess my answer would be, with Biden, that would be less. Let's put it that way. I don't think the unpredictability that was there, that's not so much part of U.S. foreign policy mechanism in any way. Saying one day and then looking in the Twitter. I remember my good friend, the U.S. ambassador here, was saying, no, we look in the Twitter first, in the morning. So never in the history of United States, the ambassador has to look to the Twitter first to see, what direction has been given to the rest of the world. So I guess my point is, with Biden, we'll have less of that. But with the return of Donald Trump, it's absolutely difficult to predict at this stage.
So, Sheffield, what do you guess?
I absolutely agree with the professor that it's probably too early to tell. I think that all experts, all polls are suggesting that the race will be very, very close. And certainly, as a member of the diplomatic corps, I would not begin to speculate on the future of an administration that's not yet happened or a president that's not yet been elected. But I do think it's an incredibly important and fascinating time to be watching U.S. politics.
Then, Shepel, what is the procedure for choosing U.S. presidential candidates? What can people do if they don't want to vote for any of the candidates?
Obviously, at this point, we've been through more than 12 months of primary process where we whittled a very large number of candidates this year down to just 2. But what's interesting is you have the 2 major political parties, like many countries in the world, but there are also several other candidates that are on the presidential ballot. So you have the Green Party and the Libertarian Party that both have candidates. So if people don't feel very strongly about the top 2 candidates, the 2 major parties, they may want to vote for one of those other minor parties, or you actually have the option to write in your own candidate. So last time around, we saw some very interesting names pop up that had been written in as a candidate for president.
Well, Councillor Shepel, why does the United States have only 2 major political parties? What about Americans who don't belong to the Democratic or Republican Party?
Well, I think what's interesting is, so we historically, the 2 major parties really started to emerge onto the scene back in the 1800s. And over time, these 2 parties, Democratic and Republican, are the sort of ancestors of those original parties. What you've seen is their philosophies and their platforms, the issues that they cared about, have changed some over time to reflect the current issues of the day and the current concerns of voters. But indeed, most people fall in these 2 parties. However, what's interesting today is about 40% of Americans would say they're actually independent and do not affiliate with one or the other, but may mix votes between parties.
I think Professor Imtiaz must add something here. Why does the United States have only two major political parties?
Well, I don't think it's an exception. Bangladesh also, we have two parties. We have A and B. So I don't think it's an exception over the years. I think they have this. They've evolved in many ways. The Republican Party, which used to be party of Abraham Lincoln, I guess now we have a different understanding of what democracy and what United States is all about. So there has been change even within the party. So, it's not like they remain fixed, the Republican agenda and the Democratic Party agenda. It has shifted quite a lot in many respects. So I guess it's not an exception, and it's difficult for a third party to come up, but you never know. People get, just to give an example, who thought BJP would be in power today in India? Nobody thought that BJP would come up. So it's very difficult to predict at this stage whether another party would come or not, but I guess it's not an exception.
Well, Professor Imtiaz and Councillor Don will talk on immigration and other issues after a short break. দর্শক দেখছেন RTV নিয়মিত আলোচনা অনুষ্ঠান Forthright। এই পর্যায়ে নিচ্ছি বিরতি। ফিরছি একটু পরেই, সে পর্যন্ত আমাদের সাথেই থাকুন। দর্শক আবারও আমন্ত্রণ Forthright অনুষ্ঠানে। আজকে কথা বলছিলাম মার্কিন প্রেসিডেন্ট নির্বাচনের বিভিন্ন দিক নিয়ে। ওয়েলকাম এগেইন বোথ অফ ইউ অ্যাট Forthright। প্রফেসর ইমতিয়াজ, in your view, what would be the US policy on foreign engagement, immigration, growing economic inequality, and even racial and religious identity?
Okay, that's a difficult question because that would depend whether Donald Trump is coming back or not. If Joe Biden or Democrats come to power, then probably there will be some reversal to some of the rhetoric or some of the decisions that Donald Trump has taken, particularly with immigration issues. I guess Joe Biden would be more open, probably would discard this walling, the whole walling United States. Some of the things that Trump took probably would be derolled. But let's go back to the pandemic. You see, the pandemic somehow impacted upon more on those who were less fortunate, the marginalized in terms of percentage, the Afro-Americans, the Hispanic population, they got more affected. So I guess if Joe Biden comes, probably there will be more focus on the underprivileged or less privileged, let's put it that way, because public health would be a big issue. Health would be a very big issue. The chances of Obamacare coming back would be one of the issue that one can think at this stage. But if Donald Trump comes back, I guess, but he's so unpredictable, so you never know. Even with immigration, he might go in a different direction altogether because the second term, he knows that he's not going to have a third term, so he don't have to pamper the crowd which votes for him. And that, I think, is very important. So since he will not have that compulsion, he might be a different person altogether. So we need to see. Yeah.
I agree with you. Well, Councillor Shripel, would you like to add on US immigration and its impact?
Well, I think that the immigration policy will continue to be something that's very important regardless of who wins the election. Certainly, it will be an important focus. But what's interesting, in this period of the global pandemic, you've really seen healthcare take a much higher priority than ever before, even in recent years. Just like in Bangladesh, for the United States, the number one issue across the board still is the economy. And that's much like it was in 2016. People want to know how they're going to make their money, how they're going to live, how they're going to take care of their families. And ultimately, the economy will be what decides when people make their vote. That's really what will determine it. But healthcare, immigration, and these other issues follow very closely behind, and during the transition period will feature very prominently during that 11 weeks between Election Day and Inauguration Day.
Well said. Ms. Shripel, if you look at the US elections, we find that the candidates participate in debates. Are these debates just so that candidates can convince voters to elect them, or do the debates have a broader meaning and impact?
I think that they do. I think the debates can be very, very important and have a very important meaning and impact on the outcome of the election. But that meaning has changed over time. The very first debates actually happened back in 1858 between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, who were at that point running for a seat in the US Senate. Back then, they actually did these stump speeches, literally standing on a stump out in the middle of the road to talk to people and then push those messages out. The goal was to tell people what they were about, what issues they stood for, what issues they were going to forward on behalf of the electorate. Those fundamental principles haven't changed, but you've had the added switch of things in the 70s, the addition of television, which changed the whole debate dynamics, as you know, in an important one between Nixon and Kennedy. How you look on TV changes how people view you. People who listened on the radio thought one candidate won the election or won the debate. People who watched on TV thought the opposite candidate won the debate. So I think that's a perfect example of the power of TV. And now in recent times, the power of social media amplifying those debates that are happening on TV. So at its core, it's to convey information, to let voters get to know their candidates a bit better. But this particular cycle, it's also been an interesting dynamic to see how they interact with one another. Whether or not you can manage the messages and gain momentum for the campaign coming out of those very important 90-minute discussions on important issues of the day. So they really do have an impact. I don't know whether they actually change people's mind, but they certainly make people feel much more informed, both about the candidate and the issues as they come to the polls.
Well, thank you. Professor Imtiaz, digital platforms are releasing a number of new policies related to disinformation, election advertising, and content moderation. How does it may impact on US presidential election?
Well, as the story goes, the Donald Trump did use that very much to come to the, to win the first time. I guess disinformation became part of politics. And that, again, is not US is not an exception. But I guess this is the new normal because, and that's the reason you have so much new apps telling you, particularly with the social media, what is fake and what is not fake. And then CNN actually monitors how many times it's a fake and how many times it's untruth. And, but I guess this is happening even in our neighboring country where a lot of information given from the highest authority would not be quote unquote truth. So I guess this is something probably will stay in this world. We just have to get used to it, and the voter has to be mature. The voter has to be concerned voter, and not just agree to whatever he is or she is listening or seeing. Because now, earlier it was seeing is believing, but now seeing may not be believing. So that part, I think, would depend on the voter. So voter maturity is required on the top of everything.
Well, thanks. Ms. Chappell, when does the new president start work? Can you explain that transfer of power?
Absolutely. So it's a bit complicated over an 11-week process, but the election day is, of course, just November 3rd, not far away now at all. But that triggers then a series of steps that lead us to a January 20th inauguration of the president, whether it's a return of the current administration or a new president. What that means is from the time that the polls close on November 3rd, they have to count the ballots. Obviously, in the United States, this could be 150 million ballots or more, depending on the turnout this year. So it will take a little bit of time. Exit polls will project, but we won't have a real number for several weeks probably, because you have to count the ballots that are coming in from around the world. So then the next big milestone is December 7th. That's when the states formally announce their electorates and which ballots are going forward. Then they meet with a joint session of Congress in the first part of January. So by about December 14th, we'll have a pretty good idea of the final decision. Then in early January, they go to a joint session of Congress, kicking off the new congressional season, leading right up to a January 20th inauguration day at noon in Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you. Well, Professor Imtiaz, our most desirable question to you, what will be the impact of U.S. election results on the U.S.-Bangladesh relationship?
We need to keep in mind humans create geopolitics. Geopolitics does not create humans. So if Bangladesh, if the growth momentum that Bangladesh has acquired, if Bangladesh can keep that momentum, and we have seen that despite the pandemic, some of the forecast is that Bangladesh is relatively better. If they can keep that momentum, there will be attention. And, I have to say, a famous Turkish poet, Nazim Hikmat, had an interesting line, and which will give you a sense. And he's a Turkish poet. He says, if there is honey in my pot, bees will come from Baghdad. So, so you see, it depends more on Bangladesh. If Bangladesh can keep the momentum of development and growth, the governance and other issues, I'm sure we will see a very productive U.S.-Bangladesh relations in the future.
Yep.
Well, Ms. Sheppel, would you like to add here on momentum, of which was mentioned by Professor Imtiaz?
I think he's exactly right. I think that there's an awful lot of very good things happening in the U.S.-Bangladesh relationship right now. And certainly we've seen a whole new round of conversation on economic matters at the end of September. A recent visit by our Deputy Secretary of State that was quite successful and highlighting the importance and energy of this bilateral relationship. And the good news is people like me, U.S. Ambassador Miller, we're still here. The momentum, we can help carry that momentum on through to the next administration. And those important matters that matter to our bilateral relationship don't change. The personalities will, potentially on the U.S. side, but the work will continue on a lot of very important matters of mutual interest.
Well, thank you very much. We are almost end of this program. Any final thought both of you want to share with our viewers, starting from Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed?
I guess when it comes to election, it's time for U.S. To go for an electoral reforms. And why I say this, because if you look at the data, way back in the 1860s, you had quite a high percentage of turnout. 81% voted. It came down to 55.5% in the last election, and that has been for quite some time, 54, 55. Mm-hmm. It really went down when Bill Clinton won for the second time, 49%. That was really shocking. I think that is where the U.S. needs to work. And one of the, I think, stumbling block has been the electoral reforms, which we have seen in the last election, where Hillary Clinton got 3 million more popular votes, but then she did not get the presidency. So that, I think, is an issue that I think will make a lot of Americans to think. And I guess the time has come. I understand the original, Don's point of view that the original idea was to balance. But then that's not working, so much. I'm sure all of us are familiar with that. So we need to, the United States, the people need to go back and do reforms which actually would make the United States much more democratic than what it is today.
Indeed. Thank you, Professor Imtiaz. And Don Sheppel, your conclusion remarks.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly let me agree with the professor that I think electoral reform will continue to be an important issue in the United States. Certainly after the election of 2000, where we had a standoff for several weeks between Bush and Gore, created another round of electoral reform that is now paying dividends today with better regulations and standards and ballot boxes and those kinds of things. But there's still a lot of work to be done within the confines of our very unique electoral college system. But that said, I think it's a very exciting time in U.S. politics because we've already had, as of today, 55 million people have already voted in this election. Turnout is high. People are waiting in line for many hours, which is not necessarily what you would want to see as in terms of good election process. But certainly it shows a commitment from the electorate to really get out their voice. And because of all of the craziness of this year, so many discussions on very challenging and difficult issues, people are really raising their voices, feel like they need to get to the ballot box and really put their votes and make them matter. And to me, that's the best, most exciting time of democracy, which is why I always get excited in filling out my ballot, but I also get excited in doing election observing and watching this process because it's messy and it's difficult, but in the end, it makes us all better because it moves us forward and it makes people very much a part of their governance structure. So I hope everybody will stay tuned, be patient, because I think it's going to be a little crazy the next couple of weeks as we see the results come forward. But in the end, come January, we will have a new president on January 20th.
Thank you, Ms. Chappell. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Imtiaz and Don Chappell, for being with us and sharing your thoughts. We hope our viewers will get clear concept on US presidential election and its process from this discussion. It's really appreciated for your participation. দর্শক, অনেক জরিপ ভবিষ্যৎবাণীকে সামনে রেখে ভোটের প্রহর গুনছেন মার্কিনীরা। বিশেষ করে করোনাকালীন এই নির্বাচন নিয়ে অনেকটা শঙ্কায় রয়েছেন ভোটাররা। তবে আগাম ভোটের পরিসংখ্যান আশার আলো দেখাচ্ছে দুই শিবিরেই। আর ম্যাজিক টিউজডের প্রতীক্ষায় রয়েছেন দুই প্রার্থী ডোনাল্ড ট্রাম্প আর জো বাইডেন, যাকে বলা হচ্ছে কন্টিনিউটি অফ হোয়াইট হাউস অথবা এই রোড টু দ্য হোয়াইট হাউস। দেখার বিষয় শেষ হাসিকে হাসেন। তবে যে প্রার্থী মার্কিন প্রেসিডেন্ট নির্বাচিত হন না কেন, বাংলাদেশ ও যুক্তরাষ্ট্রের মধ্যকার বন্ধুত্বপূর্ণ এই সম্পর্ক অটুট থাকুক, সেই প্রত্যাশা শেষ করছে আজকের অনুষ্ঠান। এতক্ষণ সঙ্গে থাকার জন্য ধন্যবাদ সবাইকে।
For more updates, subscribe and press the bell icon on YouTube app and never miss another update.